yourself for thy fall. Let dark light ease the impact and take the leap.
So first let's start with the concept of CPTSD. So with complex PTSD, we see really all of the same symptom criteria as we see with PTSD, except the trauma is conceptualized as complex trauma. So a trauma that occurred repeatedly, usually in someone's childhood, as opposed to one single event. We also see a few other characteristics that are associated more so with CPTSD than PTSD, like emotional regulation difficulties, with anger and areas of sensitivity, with dissociation, and again, of course, this occurs with PTSD, but it's considered more here in CPTSD. Difficulty with self-perception, like shame, guilt, a negative concept of self, a distorted image of the perpetrator, so a preoccupation with revenge or focus on that relationship with the perpetrator, interpersonal relationship difficulties like distrust and isolation, and of loss of meaning, like hopelessness. So when we look at the areas of overlap between CPTSD and borderline personality disorder, we see a number of symptoms. We have mood dysregulation, a feeling of emptiness, loneliness, increased sense of guilt, increased difficulties with anger, and decreased self-worth. So some characteristics and symptoms we see with borderline personality disorder that we don't typically see with CPTSD, or we don't see them to the same extent, would be the self-harm and suicidal behavior component with borderline personality disorder, the attempts to avoid abandonment, the fear of abandonment, paranoia, impulsivity, the love-hate cycle that we sometimes see with borderline personality disorder, idealization and devaluation, and the unstable sense of self. Now, with CPTSD, there is a negative sense of self, as I mentioned. With borderline personality disorder, we think of it more as an unstable self-concept. So somebody with borderline personality disorder could have a negative self-concept one day and a positive self-concept the next. So really, the unstable component makes it a bit different than what we see with CPTSD. It's fairly easy to see how it could be etiological for CPTSD, complex trauma. It makes sense that complex trauma could lead to the symptoms we see with PTSD, and evidence tends to support that. Now, with borderline personality disorder, the story is quite a bit different. Many individuals who have borderline personality disorder do have a trauma in their history, and a lot of times that is complex trauma. However, about 10 to 20% of individuals with borderline personality disorder have no trauma history at all. Also, we know that with borderline personality disorder, there's a substantial genetic component. It's heritable. 42% of the variance in the symptoms of borderline personality disorder can be explained by genetics. That's a substantial portion.